Well, first of all, thank you to the organizers, and thank you to all of you for coming out on what's starting to be a spring evening and spending some time so we can talk about what matters to us here in the 7th Congressional District. So, as Tom stated, I have been a physician in the 7th Congressional District for 25 years. I'm a kidney physician, and actually during that time, I actually have spent time coming up here to Minocqua to help out with the kidney practice over the years. So I certainly am acquainted with the medical care here in the Northwoods. But the other part of this is having lived in the 7th Congressional District for 25 years, and I've raised my children in this district. And clearly, I think it's what we all do when we raise our children, is we want to teach them of what are important values. And certainly the things that were important for my children to learn were that community and service were two core values of what it took to grow up to be adults. And so in community service, beyond the physician work, I've also been involved with things like helping get Habitat for Humanity started. When the group got called together, I got to be involved with the initial group back in the 1990s. So we did that, and at that time my children were grade school age, and so when it came time to stuff ballots, they were there stuffing ballots with us, or not ballots, stuffing. Good idea. Stuffing donation envelopes. Stuffing envelopes. So yes, we had the children there stuffing envelopes. But so we got the kids there at the beginning of it, and certainly when it was time for the homeless shelter to be built, not only did we play a part in contributing, but I got to do what I enjoy doing, which is put on my tool belt and show up and do the work. So, and when we have we have food insecurity in our communities, we certainly have the opportunity to participate in how we support our food pantries. So all of those different areas of where are the needs in the community, how can we be of service, has been a crucial part of my time here in the 7th Congressional District. Well, then of course this whole issue of service came into the idea of getting into the political world, and how did that happen? So of course, in November of 2016, I think a lot of us realized that the world was changing in ways that we weren't sure that we agreed with in terms of the election of November 2016. And so, I think we too spent a little bit of time cursing the darkness and then realized it was time to start lighting some candles. And so certainly in our part of the district, groups started forming, just ad hoc groups of people coming together to say, what do we do to change the political discussion? And so some of those meetings happened in our home, and we would talk about what can we do politically. And so we started writing letters to our current representatives in the Senate and in the House and at the state level, and realized that most of the people who got elected in November 2016 really did not have much interest in what we had to say. And it really came down to the conclusion that it's like, well, really what matters is elections. And what matters is having candidates who are willing to stand up and run in the elections so that every race is contested, because we are learning that pretty much every race can be winnable. I mean, whether it be the 18th Congressional District in Pennsylvania, whether it's the 10th state Senate race over on the western side where Patty Shockner flipped that point by 20 points compared to what President Trump had won. Even the race in Arizona where the Democrat didn't win, she got it within 5 points. This is a race, they didn't even have a Democratic candidate 2 years ago, and she got it within 5 points. So every race, yes, absolutely. Every race needs to be challenged. We need to give people the option to choose something other than what we currently have. And so certainly realizing that elections matter. The next thing that happened is last summer when the Congress was trying to dismantle and destroy the health care in our country and how it's paid for. I started giving talks around town because of my history with healthcare and healthcare executive work. So I would just talk to people so they could understand the complexities of the Affordable Care Act, what it had done, as well as the harm that would be done under the bill that had passed the House, and of course eventually only didn't pass because John McCain put his thumb down after midnight one night. So yes, absolutely. And what that bill would have done, if that bill would have become law, if you take a 60-year-old who's earning $30,000 here in northern Wisconsin, currently they're paying about 8% of their income for their health insurance because it's capped under the Affordable Care Act. If that bill would have become law, their insurance premium would have jumped to 40% of their income, which basically would have totally priced them out of the ability to have insurance. And of course, the language of that is, well, they're choosing not to have insurance. Like, no, they're choosing to have food on the table and pay their rent, and then there's nothing left. So clearly, having given talks and worked on understanding what the threat was to the people I take care of as a doctor certainly motivated me to get more involved. And then last fall, the third event that really took me from this interest in providing service to a much more tangible response was that a good friend of ours, Ben, came back to Marshfield. He had been at a meeting and said, you know, we should work on United to Amend here in Marshfield. This is something we can do. So United to Amend is a national organization that is working at getting a grassroots level to pass resolutions at the local levels all the way up to the state level, calling for a constitutional amendment that would say that corporations are not people and money is not free speech. So last fall, we started on October 1, and we needed to gather just shy of 1,400 signatures in the city of Marshfield to get this resolution on the ballot. And between Ben's work, Kathleen's work, and my work, and all the people we got to work with us, this was definitely a huge team effort. We got those signatures in under 40 days. We got the resolution on the ballot, and it was on the April ballot, and it passed with 81% in favor, people in Marshfield. And the good news is that same resolution also passed in Wittenberg, it passed in St. Croix County, it passed in Rice Lake. So over and over and over again, this keeps coming forward. So now a majority of people in Wisconsin have had a chance to weigh in on this issue, and when given the option, they pass it with an over 75% majority. So clearly this is an issue which the people are ready for, and now we just have to get the politicians probably changed out, because the current politicians seem to be rather stuck on all this dark money. And we witness what this does to us, where we have people, we have no idea who they are, what their true interests are, and they're saturating the airwaves with negative campaigning. So clearly getting involved with that last fall was the last kind of step for me. And so in December and January, I started exploring the option of being in the campaign. I talked with people at the state, I talked to people at the national level, and they said, there isn't anyone who's currently considering that should dissuade you from doing this. And so with that motivation, they kind of like, lead the charge. So with that, that is what led me to jump into this race. And so certainly we announced on February 28th. It's already been an excellent coming up here on 2 months. Certainly have excellent campaign staff, and most importantly, an incredibly talented and supportive spouse who So I guess I would say, if anybody ever said to me, what's like a crucial part of running a political campaign? I said, be married to someone who's a professional at forming relationships, because that's the way you get this done. So that's been extremely helpful. So in terms of, what do I see the country needs? One thing I think the country desperately needs, a change in the tone of leadership. And first of all, in terms of my, as Dr. Ewert mentioned, I'm a physician. So I have been spending 30 years now. I've been a physician for over 30 years. And certainly when I get called to the intensive care unit, it's because there's a critical need that needs to be met. And when I show up, I join with an entire team of professionals who then tends to the needs of that patient. And we obviously don't care about political affiliation or anything. We take care of that patient. We stay focused. So we work together as a team because we're focused on the necessary outcome. And then as clinic president, so that came in 2012, I became the president of the Marshfield Clinic. And prior to that, I went and got another degree because I figured if I'm going to do this, and actually Dr. Crump was the key one. He and I were driving back from Ladysmith one day. And I said, well, John, we'd been at a board meeting. I said, well, I'm thinking about running for clinic president. And he said, well, if you're going to do that, you probably should know something about running a business. So the good news about John is I usually don't have to wonder what he's thinking, which was extremely helpful. which was extremely helpful. So I went and got a business degree because I figured, it's one thing to understand complex kidney disease, it's another thing to understand complex medical business. So I got my business degree, and clearly what I learned is what it's like to lead a team of rivals. Because trust me, if you put 11 physicians on a board, we don't have unanimity within the first few minutes of the discussion. But it was always very energized discussion, and there were key problems we needed to solve. And one of them was the relationship between the Family Health Center and Marshall Clinic. It just needed to be tidied up. And why that's important is because the way that the opioid crisis is being addressed just down the road here is through the Family Health Center, which is a community health center within the federal government structure of how we care for people. And so working through the challenges of how the Marshall Clinic and the Family Health Center related were crucial to providing dental care for the disadvantaged and children, and now what Greg Nitsch and others have now gone into is the whole thing of addressing the opioid crisis. So those things mattered. And they mattered because we need to address the needs of our communities. And so those were examples of where I've exercised my leadership in terms of doing that. Because, what we're seeing in the country with some of the leadership and certainly some of the media is that they're using hate and anger and fear to drive wedge issues and to drive neighbor against neighbor and to disrupt communities. And we're still learning a lot about what happened with Russian intervention in the election. But what became very clear very early on is it wasn't so much it didn't matter so much what side they were on. They just wanted to disrupt us. And so they would publish posts to get two opposing views of people out to a town square so that a riot would result. So I think one of the most patriotic acts we can do is to actually live in our communities, know our neighbors, be respectful, and have civil discourse with each other. And remember that at the end of the day, yes, thank you. At the end of the day, we do live in communities, not political parties, and we clearly need to solve our problems within our communities. Well, in terms of some of the specific issues, because obviously at the end of the day, it comes down to what policies come out of the changes. Well, healthcare, near and dear to my heart, obviously. That's what I've devoted my life to, but it also continues to be top of mind. And as Democrats, we can take a lot of pride in this because we are the party that said when elders at the time of retirement, people all of a sudden became uninsurable and had no health care, came about Medicare. When people lost their job, you had Medicaid. When veterans needed care, you have the VA system. When our Native Americans need care, you have the Indian health system. When you have communities that need, you have the community health centers. And finally then, when we still had over 20 million Americans without insurance, you have the Affordable Care Act. So we have the history. But of course, our work is not done because we're still spending twice as much as every similar country and getting a worse product. And we know that there are key drivers of why we're spending so much money, and it does have to do with pharmaceuticals, it has to do with certain high-priced procedures which are drastically overpriced, it has to do with the administrative burden, and it has to do with a few procedures which are done often that are priced extremely highly in the United States. Is the four major differences between how we practice medicine here in the United States and how it's practiced elsewhere. Well, in terms of what are the next steps forward? Well, first of all, one of them is going to be pharmaceutical costs. Because then what amazes me is that as physicians, we have been told from Medicare since the 1980s how much will be paid for a given service. So if we do a consult, if I do dialysis, that's a Medicare fee schedule. It doesn't matter what's charged, that's what's paid. Hospitals have been under what's called DRGs since the 1980s. So hospitals and doctors actually have their Medicare payments locked in through the fee schedule. Pharmaceuticals, there is not a pharmaceutical fee schedule. And that's because when they wrote Medicare Part D, which was written by a legislator who became a pharmaceutical lobbyist, surprisingly, they actually wrote into the law that you couldn't go out and negotiate on price. And so the result of this is if you have hepatitis C in Switzerland, you pay $16,000 to get cured. And if you have it in the United States, take the same drug, you pay $30,000 to get cured. And that's the crazy discrepancy we have in terms of pharmaceuticals. So there's clearly some areas that in Congress we can work towards some bipartisan solutions with broad public support to start bringing down healthcare costs. Now the other thing which the Republicans have now handed to us through the most recent tax bill is they took away the individual mandate. And President Obama, he really thought in 2008 that he said, okay, we tried the Democratic idea of universal health care in the 90s and that didn't work. So let's bring out pretty much the Republican game plan. That's what the Affordable Care Act was. It's the Republican game plan. And so the Republican game plan was always use insurance and use the individual mandate because you got to get everybody in the pool. It's the only way insurance works. It doesn't work if not everyone's contributing to the pool out of which resources will be drawn for the few people who suffer significant medical costs. So they went with the individual mandate. Well, immediately all of a sudden, of course, that got attacked to the point where they wrote the enforcement out of the bill. And so now there's no longer an individual mandate. Well, then you have to say, oh, well, what was the other option besides individual mandate? Aha, it was the public option. And so that you open up public option, you say we're going to have build on another public program that people can choose to buy into, and then just work through all the hard policy making of how you create that, with the whole goal of decreasing the cost and making sure that it's affordable to all Americans, regardless of their income levels. So I think that's going to be the next avenue to go at to make sure that all Americans have affordable, accessible health care. Turning to another area, obviously healthcare is crucial for our economy, but another area is the whole issue of education. And the federal government, gets, first of all, the attack on public education is, to me, mind-boggling. I just like, how could you do that? I mean, apple pie, I guess, is next. I mean, because, what has made the U.S. economy so powerful is public education, which goes back to the founders of the country. Basically, they said when you map out how we're going to map out the country, we're actually going to tell you where the public school goes because we know that public education is crucial to democracy. And back in the late 1700s, we're starting this experiment called democracy. So clearly, public education is what makes America, America. And we need to value it and support it. In terms of the federal part of that, obviously, there's Head Start to make sure children get the good start. There's the support for public schools in terms of disadvantaged and disabled children. And then there's the issue, which has now grown substantially, is the after high school education. And how is that funded and how is that paid for? And now we have this huge problem of $1.5 trillion of debt in student loans, which is hobbling our young adults to enter in to become financially stable and enter the full economy. With the amount of debt burden of $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 of student loans plus credit card debt on top of that, these young adults are not joining into communities, able to purchase houses, and to really reach that point of financial stability. So clearly, we need to find ways to decrease the student loan debt burden, how we finance after high school education. I think it is important. Certainly it was important to me to have some skin in the game as I went through college. And so I was building bridges and tying rebar to pour concrete on bridges. And I think that was okay to have some work, my work involved in my education. But at the same time, I was able to come out of college and eventually med school with a very small amount of debt that was under an appropriate amount of interest so I could quickly pay it off and move on with my life. Another part that's crucial to our economy here is infrastructure, roads, bridges, and broadband. Clearly this is on this long list of Congress neglecting their duty for the last 7 years. Infrastructure, this should be bipartisan. We should not have to argue about that we're going to build the infrastructure that allows our economy to work efficiently. And clearly we need our roads repaired, we need our bridges strong for the logging trucks and the lumber products that are traveling. And now we need the new highway of the broadband, because clearly that's no longer a luxury item, and so absolutely. Here in the 7th Congressional District, there are vast stretches that have inadequate broadband access. No, and yeah, that's right. Thank you. But and clearly, and so this isn't just so that you can look at the pictures of your kids on Facebook. This is more than that. This is childhood education. This is how children do homework now. This is how entrepreneurs set up business. This is how people transition between jobs. We have people, those who do live in areas that have broadband, they can lose one job, they can take on another job from their home and continue to live in the 7th Congressional District if they have that access. But if they don't, they need to leave the area. So, and as adults get to the point where they want to retrain, just like when I got my degree back in 2012, most of that work was done through the internet. And then I'd go on campus a few times a year. So clearly, continuing education and now healthcare. Because one of the ways we decrease healthcare costs is we keep people out of the hospital. One of the ways you keep people out of the hospital is you know what's going on in their home and you have ready access to it. And that's where having in-home access through internet access becomes crucial to providing the medical care people that they need in their home. So this, an issue, this should be absolutely a bipartisan issue. It should be something that we're all in favor of because it's going to help all the constituents in the 7th Congressional District. An issue that is certainly near and dear to those of us who love the North Woods is environment. And the reason I'm in Wisconsin. So I went to medical school in a state south of here, which won't be named. So unless people from there want to come up here and spend some money, which although of course at that time in our life we were just popping a tent up on a lake and watching the osprey. So we clearly, we are so tied into our environment here in northern Wisconsin. We're the headwaters of the water that gives life to everyone between here and New Orleans. This is where people come to recreate and recreate. And so we have this need to preserve this forest, which we now manage. But there's obviously the bigger issue of climate change. And climate change, the science is as sound as any science we have. We need to take action. And again, this can be a very positive move because for one thing, it's a national security issue because we've already had the war in Syria, which was based on climate change and a drought. We have the economic impact of Houston being under 4 feet of water, and then all of us as a national community coming together to help bail them out. And then we have the healthcare issue of Puerto Rico having their factories. Yes, the factories have been decimated that produce the IV fluid, and so we routinely get messages of like, you've got to be careful with how much IV fluid you're giving because the factory in Puerto Rico is not up to full speed yet. So we're all connected in this climate change issue. The other healthcare thing is that diseases that used to be tropical diseases are moving into the United States. So this is an issue that affects us on multiple levels, and the solution is good for our economy. When we hire people to install solar panels, when we hire people to improve fuel efficiency, when we develop ways in which we can build solar panels and other renewable features, that can be done here in Wisconsin. You don't need an oil field to be part of the energy generation. So addressing climate change, to me, it is all positive. The only negative is if vast amounts of your wealth reside in the carbon industry, but that's the only downside if that happens to be your piggy bank. For the rest of it, it's all positive change. So clearly, we need to address that. I already mentioned Citizens United, crucial thing. Certainly I would be ready to be in Congress to co-sponsor the amendment to overturn Citizens United because the two current, yes. The two, I'd say, fundamental problems in American politics right now, one is state, one is federal. The federal one is Citizens United. The state one is gerrymandering. Because once those two issues are dealt with, you now have a level playing field. And so we can compete. Right now, amazingly, Democrats are winning races even though the races are skewed the other direction. In 2012, a majority of people in Wisconsin voted Democratic, and yet we ended up with a majority legislature that was Republican. So clearly, we need a level playing field. There's ways to do that for gerrymandering at the state level. At the federal level, it's all about Citizens United. And I think all of this feeds into what do we do to keep the rural economy going? Because there's just some sense in the rural economy and in the 7th District that we get left behind. Whether it's the broadband issue, whether it's people trying to take away the health care from people here, whether it's that we can't get educated because we don't have broadband. And we clearly need to address these things so that we're not being left behind, that we can keep up with other parts of the country. So, in conclusion, as a physician, I've been caring for patients and I've cared for them in their trials. I've certainly admired their strengths and I've celebrated their joys when things go well. And that requires a significant amount of attention and learning and study on my part, as well as being willing to take action to help people improve their health. And that same skills of study and paying attention and then taking action are the gifts that I would like to offer to the people in the 7th Congressional District. So thank you very much, and we'll move to a time of taking questions.
Early in the year.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think Ryan's going to take a couple of questions, if there are any.
I think Richard had one of those.
I was just wondering what your position on the
Right, so the question is about stance on marijuana. Well, first of all, I don't think anybody's tax dollars need to be wasted on enforcing anti-marijuana laws. I think it's a waste of our tax dollars. Yes, I mean, you know, imprisoning people or having people lose opportunities because they have a small amount of marijuana in their car is just a waste of our resources and a waste of our youth or anybody who gets caught up in that. So I think decriminalization is important. I think, as with all chemicals, there are some humans who, no matter what chemical it is, whether it's caffeine, tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, etc., are prone to it leading to a life where they aren't able to participate in the community, they aren't able to care for their family. So I think that's why the issue is it's not like it's a wide open field where it solves every problem. But certainly decriminalization, I think, is crucial so that we focus on stuff that matters. So, yes.
Yes, you know, you were talking about education, and I agree that college students get burdened with too much debt. But I think there's a more fundamental issue going on right now, and that starts with the cabinet member or
Eddie DeVos? Eddie DeVos,
and
yes.
that's charter schools.
Yep.
Charter schools are undercutting public schools,
Yeah.
and we're dumbing down our population because the rich people or the higher middle class people can send their kids to those charter schools, and the people in the inner cities cannot send their kids to charter schools, and they are getting a less education.
Right, I think it comes down to where we have public funds go to public schools. And we need to make sure, and because otherwise there is this unlevel playing ground with the voucher schools, because if you run a private school and you have a child who's struggling to learn through the standard curriculum, or they have behavioral problems, the private school can say, oh, you just don't fit in here. And they transfer them back to the public school. Meanwhile, the public school's funds have been cut, so they don't have the resources to address the needs of those children. You know, I will say, you know, certainly my own experience, you know, growing up, and then my children's experience in school is I was so impressed with what they learned in school, at public school, that didn't have anything to do with the curriculum. But they learned to just get to know everyone in the community. And it turned out, I think it was a good thing. Our house was kind of the magnet for where everybody ended up, you know, on Friday night. At least we knew where they were. They were in our basement. But you know, it was from all walks of life. That's who, you know, were hanging out with my kids. And I thought it was great for them to learn that we're all in this community together. So I think the public education has a lot of positive. We need to support it. We need to value it. We need to send messages that it is of value instead of sending messages that somehow public education doesn't have value or that teachers aren't worthy. And those are really the horrible messages that have been sent.
An issue that you will be faced with up here, and probably throughout the 7th Congressional District, is the issue of gun control.
Guns, yeah. Yep.
And I mean, for instance, I've had to vote on those issues in the past.
Yeah.
So what I would ask you is, have you formulated a response that is comprehensive, and B, what is your response regarding control of assault weapons and background checks?
Right. So in terms of guns, the issue is, you know, the position on the issue of guns, which certainly the Parkland killing and now the Nashville shooting, you know, these keep raising this issue. So in terms of guns, there's several points. One is we have a constitutional amendment, and we clearly have millions and millions of people who very responsibly own their guns, maintain their guns, and are not a threat to anyone, and they take part in hunting. And certainly that's completely honorable and should be maintained. Our issue is, how do we keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people? And I think that gets to be the core question. And there are some very specific steps we can take. And the good news is the state legislature in Florida and the state legislature in Vermont is taking those steps. And they're showing that we can now go into this space. It used to be that, oh, you can't touch that or else you won't have a chance. Well, it turns out the people in the United States are ready for responsible gun ownership, and they're also ready that everyone gets life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and you don't have 17 young people dying in 6 minutes in Parkland because of irresponsible gun ownership. So in terms of the tangible things to do, one is the background checks. And the key issue is that if guns transfer ownership, just like our cars, we don't transfer the ownership of our cars without transferring registration. So guns transfer through a registration process, because that way we know that the person who is now possessing the gun does not have something in their background which has deemed them an irresponsible member of our society. I mean, then these tragedies have happened. The person who had the multiple fatality killing in Texas. The system should have caught him. He was a convicted domestic violence person. He should not have been allowed to have a gun, even under the current laws, but unfortunately the current laws are so weak they don't even work. So we definitely need complete, thorough background checks. I think the other is to understand gun fatalities. And so in this part of Wisconsin, if you have a gun in your home, the chances are 10 times higher that that gun will be used for suicide rather than for a murder. And so for most Americans, the biggest risk of a gun in the home is that someone you love and someone you care for will end up dying because at a point of despair, they'll get access to the gun. And that comes down to that we need to understand the gun deaths. And so there was this amendment passed in the 90s. It's called the Dickey Amendment. And the interpretation of that was that there could be no research done. No federal dollars could go to researching gun deaths. I mean, that's as absurd as if we had Ebola and said, well, we're not going to research Ebola. I mean, that's nuts. We have 30,000 Americans dying a year from gun deaths. We should understand how that's happening and why that's happening. Well, the data that we have to date is that of those 30,000 deaths, 20,000 are suicides. And so it would be good in terms of decreasing gun deaths to have an understanding of when does that happen. And so if you are a gun owner and you have a despondent 17-year-old in your house, maybe it's time to get more trigger locks and put your guns away. Maybe it's time to take them to the neighbors. Do something so that you protect your child. And certainly I have had patients who opted to utilize suicide to resolve problems because they could do that. My first wife, Sharon, worked as a home health dietitian in North Carolina, and sure enough, it was a World War II vet. He ended his life behind the barn. I mean, so the guns in the home, for the most part, the most dangerous event of that is suicide, so we need to pay attention to that. And then we have these mass fatality killings. And clearly, the ones that just really tear at our heart, and are just because it's such a violation, are the school ones, and those clearly, as they should. But actually, the most common scenario with a mass fatality killing is domestic violence. And that's what the story was in Rothschild about a year ago. That's what the story was in Crandon 10 years ago. That's what the story was in Abbotsford. It was just within this year. And what happens is you do have people who are identifiable who are at high risk for committing mass fatalities. And that's where you have this issue of red flag laws. And so that you have people in the states that exist, like California, that if someone is identified, someone raises concerns just like Nicholas, the perpetrator in Florida, where multiple people said, this guy's dangerous, but they had no mechanism to go to his house. So the goal is that you take the complaint to law enforcement. Law enforcement has to take that to a judge. So this is not just an arbitrary someone losing their constitutional right. This is a legal process, just like we don't get searched, our home doesn't get searched without a legal process and a judge making a decision that there's probable cause. So having red flag laws. So I think there are ways that we can keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people, and also we can understand how gun deaths are happening so that we don't have the tragedies. Yes?
Can we count on you to support HR 676 so that we can get health care rather than health insurance?
Give me HR 67, go ahead and give me that.
It's improved Medicare for all.
So currently, the challenge with Medicare for All is that Medicare, for the most part, reimburses below the current cost points of medical care.
That's why it needs to be improved.
And so it does need to be improved. So that's where, and I think we need to continue on this step by step. And that's where I think the next option is the public option. And the natural course of that may well be that more and more people would end up migrating there because Medicare's administrative costs are at about 5%. It's a highly efficient insurance company. Whereas by law now, if you're a for-profit insurer, you can only spend 20% of your premium on administrative costs. It used to be higher than that. So they actually have to, by law, do 80%. If you're a non-for-profit insurer, you have to do 85%. So we need to move to a public option as part of offering a more efficient model. But I think the other challenge with Medicare for All is that about 80% of people actually don't seek medical care very often. And what consumes a lot of the energy of medical care is about 5% of the population using 50% of the resources. And this gets to be the political realities of this. And this is what happened to the 1990s with the plan and all of the backlash since 2010 with the ACA, is that in that most people aren't thinking about insurance very much in their medical care, they're very prone to being scared by negative messages away from any plan that's brought forward. And so that's why I think we need to stay on a step-by-step approach. And right now, going after pharmaceuticals should be easy and bipartisan. So let's go where we can get some bipartisan support. And then working towards a public option should also be so that we can get more people into an affordable plan. And then, like I say, keep taking the steps.
I'm going to ask you to crunch the numbers on improved Medicare for All. I think you'll be surprised. It'll save us all money.
Right.
Physicians for national health care say it won't work. That a public option will not work, that we need to have the improved Medicare.
Yeah, I think it depends on how you structure it. If you allow people to buy in, they pay a premium, and then you have networks. But I think that's the goal, is to make sure that we go towards political solutions that stay close enough to the middle so that they persist. And I think that's the goal. But I think and I think some of this ends up with how we end up with the specific policies we're going to debate and discuss and work through. I think it comes down to the core values, and I said that's the core value, is we need accessible, affordable health care for everyone in the U.S. And so when you're faced with a healthcare crisis, you're not faced with a financial crisis.
Now, the last number I had.
There are many more people that got questions. Excuse me, sir. We got many more questions we have to get to. Okay, we're going to pass on that.
Let me finish. I think it's important. The
think
last
it's very
number I had
important.
was that 60% of the population approves of the idea of HR 676.
Okay.
And I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Go ahead in the back.
Yeah, there are three words that you use, or a word 3 times, bipartisan. I love that. It's a great idea. I hope you can accomplish it. I'd like to speak to 2 other topics, immigration and the military.
Well, certainly military, we are a nation state, and we need to have a military that can defend the national interests. I think the key issue is to make sure that we are defending our national interests and that we continue to use our military to support our core values as we utilize our military outside the U.S. borders. And so it is important to make sure that we do have a strong military in this country, like I say, that defends our values and our country as a nation state. In terms of immigration, this was a huge failure of the current Congress in 2013. They actually had a bill that passed the Senate with over 60 votes. It wasn't a perfect bill, but everybody got something out of it. The Republicans got more border control. Democrats got pathways to legal residency. And so it was a bill that they had worked on, and they'd found compromises. It went over to the House of Representatives, and they didn't even take it up. They wouldn't even debate it. They wouldn't modify it. They wouldn't even amend it and go to conference committee. So I think it was a failure of the current leadership in Congress. So in terms of immigration, we have 11 million people in this country who are in the shadows. And those 11 million people, they're doing work. They are part of our economy. If you extracted out all of the people who are not here legally in Wisconsin, it would be an $8 billion subtraction from the Wisconsin economy. So it's a huge problem for us. I can tell you that in the dairy part of the state, it's a huge problem for the cows because they're not going to get milked. And so you're going to have a lot of unhappy cows. So clearly, we need ways in which we have guest workers. We have needing ways towards ways people have legal status. Certainly, the Dreamers, that should be a no-brainer in terms of these people came here as children. They have lived here for years. They are productive. Many of them have gone to graduate school or professional school. They've served in the military. Clearly, they need to be moved on the pathway. So I think we do need to address immigration. We need to have a way to bring workers in who we need. This country from the outset, ever since certainly for the last 3 or 4 centuries, the economy has basically grown through immigration. And even now, we don't have enough workers for nursing homes. We don't have enough workers for cheese factories. I visited one cheese factory, 10% of the workforce is Ukrainian because he gets J1 visas, people coming in. And of course, our health care in the North Woods, we wouldn't have health care without good immigration policies in ways that our colleagues can come here and serve the people in the 7th Congressional District. So clearly we need immigration reform, find it through there. Go ahead.
Bipartisanship always sounds good, but we've got a deeper problem, I think. If you look back the last 3 decades, Democrats have had a majority in Congress numerous times and accomplished very little because we couldn't seem to work together. And I want you to talk about how you think you can get Democrats to focus on some particular issues and actually get things done.
Well, certainly the 2 crucial years were 2008 to 2010. And actually, if you look at the period of time from when Al Franklin's vote was finally counted to when Ted Kennedy died, it was about 6 months. And so that was really the only window where Democrats were actually able to pass legislation without any Democratic support. And in that time, the Affordable Care Act came in. Of course, the plan was to modify it, and then Ted Kennedy died and Scott Brown came in, and so it was not a filibuster-proof Senate. So I think in terms of working towards, I think we try and focus, as we do certainly in business and in healthcare, you stay focused on what's important. So our problems in the 7th District are rural problems. I think it's important to find Congress people from other rural districts and say, we need to solve our rural problems. And so let's start there, because it may be Republicans from Kansas, but they're dealing with the same issues of infrastructure and broadband issue and the rural economy and immigration for their workers. So there are areas that we can work together. So I think you try and identify some early wins so that we can get some things passed, because there's a backlog of issues to be addressed. In the back.
I want to address this to everybody here. We could fill a room like this in 100 different places and you still wouldn't win. If you don't put this on your automobile, then you're just clapping for nothing. If you don't talk to your neighbor, if you don't learn as much as he learns and has discovered, then you're not going to be able to convince anybody to vote for him. Put this, when you leave today, if you don't, we'll provide you with the cloth that you need to wipe your car down. Ask John out at the bar, he'll give you some napkins. Put this on your car, for crying out loud. The problem in northern Wisconsin is we're not willing to stand up for the things we clapped for and the things we clapped for.
Yes, and thank you. And the other thing that we have in the back, we do have yard signs too. So yard signs are available. So.
Will you be able to do something to stop Foxconn?
So the question was about Foxconn. The question is about Foxconn. I think the main thing to do to stop Foxconn is to make sure that we elect Democrats at the state level, because that was a state governor and state legislature, and I think that's why the whole ballot matters. It matters at the county board, it matters at the school board, it matters the assembly, the state senate, U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and president. It's the whole ballot matters. So I think that's the key issue.
We're going to take 1 or 2 more questions, please.
I think freedom of press and freedom of journalism is important, and we are not getting that. Right. And it's Sinclair buying up more stations and news broadcasters having to say whatever they want them to say. We are not having freedom of the press, and I think that's important.
Well, and I think, we had this policy in the past that you needed to have equal time if you use the public airwaves. So that's one thing if people are plugging into the internet and going through, getting it through a channel that way. But clearly when people are using broadcast, they're using the spectrum for TV broadcast, I think we're turning to where things did need to be equal access in terms of the fairness of the portrayal of political views. So you didn't have the newscasters actually sending in their perspective as opposed to just reporting. I mean, many of us remember Walter Cronkite. We turned him on and we thought he was pretty much just giving us the information. He wasn't giving us his political views.
I just want to add an observation because they're somewhat of a false equivalency, because I think one of your biggest challenges is going to be how do you confront the politics of fear that so successfully has put the Republicans in power.
Yeah.
Because they use it and they're just unscrupulous.
I think one thing is to call it out and to name it and just say, if someone is talking to you and they're making you scared or angry or hateful, and particularly against the people who live on your block or in your town, it's a moment of reflection and to say, is this who we are? I mean, is this how we got here? So I think it is naming that. I mean, I'm amazed when I am exposed to that kind of media, like if I'm in the medical settings, often people have various channels on and I'll hear it. And I'm amazed how skillful it is at just sending in those subtle messages of fear and anger and hatred. And I think we just need to call it out. And I think to your point about how campaigns are successful, they're successful by conversations around breakfast tables at the diner. And it doesn't need to be confrontational. It's just open-ended questioning and say, well, what about this? And how do we solve this problem in our community? And I think you start moving people towards that community discussion. But it's not an easy issue.
I just want to say thank you so much for running. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to run these days. You'll be attacked. And all of us that are sitting here in this room have benefited from knowing your knowledge and how much you've studied. But I would like to jump onto what Irv said. He can't win unless we give him money. The fact is that Sean Duffy has over $2 million right now and more. And he's got the lobbyists with him. If we don't help Dr. Ewert by giving him money, he will not win, because that's the way we get our message out. So not only do we have to support him in the coffee shops and in our communities, but we have to give him money. So all of you today, if you haven't written a check, write one. And if you wrote one, write another one. So please, thank you for running.
Thank you.
Everybody, please.
Thank you.
Joe and Bill, Karen and I thank you all for coming tonight. You are welcome to stay a while longer if you would like. In the back is Zoe. The only guy with a tie over here is David. No offense. They're the staffers. They're the guys who make it work. If you have questions, if you want to help out. I should have known that Chris and Irv would have given my speech for me because I've heard it from them so many times before. But some is not a dollar amount. There has to be a money behind it to make it work. And soon is not the time you help. Today is the day you help. You reach out to other people. You continue the discussion. There's a long way to go between now and November. This is not the last time we'll all get together. We have many other opportunities. We need to reach out to our neighbors, engage them in the conversation.